We're back with part 2 of lecture 14 and 15 on the Great Depression and the New Deal. While FDR may have earned the gratitude of many average Americans based upon his willingness to reach out to them via his fireside chats, or his ability to create federal jobs, or to provide direct assistance through agencies like the FERA, he's also earning some pretty influential enemies on both sides of the political aisle. On the left, there were those like Huey Long who criticized the president's programs and claimed that they only benefited a handful of people rather than the majority of those in need. Long was a very vocal critic of the AAA, for example, claiming that payments that were made to American farmers went to the biggest American farmers rather than helping out small farmers. Also, he criticized the NRA for only benefiting large American producers rather than helping out, say, mom and pop style shops in neighborhoods across the country. To change this, Long will be campaigning for the presidency, and as part of his bid for the presidency in 1936, he's going to begin taking to the campaign trail criticizing the president's programs for not doing enough to help out average American families. He will claim instead that his Share the Wealth program would see to it that each head of household would receive $5,000 should he be made president. Long was a potentially serious contender for the presidency in the 1936 election, but he was assassinated the year prior in 1935 in the Louisiana State House. FDR also had critics on the other end of the political spectrum. While folks like Long criticized the president for not doing enough to help out, the American Liberty League, a bipartisan group, meaning of both Republican and Democratic politicians and their supporters, the American Liberty League will criticize the president for doing too much. Fearful of government regulation, higher taxes, and union organization, many industrialists became convinced that Roosevelt was really a socialist in disguise, bent on government takeover of the economy. The American Liberty League will gather support from some of the most high-profile corporations in the United States, such as General Motors, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, Chase National Bank, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and they will collect donations from many of these very large corporations and use those donations to hire lawyers. What the American Liberty League wants to do is to overturn many of FDR's New Deal agencies in court. They felt that FDR's New Deal was leading the country into bankruptcy and socialism, and that there was no constitutional precedent for a president to create these agencies. And what we'll see is, as early as 1935, the NRA will be struck down as constitutional by the Supreme Court, in part because of the American Liberty League's challenge to it. Clearly, FDR had made enemies in the business community, but he remained firm in his faith that his New Deal programs would ultimately help Americans out of the Depression. And as the next presidential contest looms, the 1936 presidential contest, he is campaigning for re-election on the idea that he needed to do even more to aid the poor and downtrodden. Such rhetoric was wildly popular with the American voting public, and what we're going to end up seeing is in the lead up to the 1936 election, Roosevelt is going to announce several new reform initiatives. Whereas the first New Deal concentrated on providing immediate relief to the poor and unemployed, Roosevelt's second New Deal, rolled out in 1935, will focus more on social reform and labor issues. This is where we see the creation of the Social Security system that we still have today. It enrolled a majority of working Americans in a pension program that guaranteed for them a steady income upon retirement. For those who couldn't work, it also provided public assistance. Another important piece of legislation pushed through during the Second New Deal was the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. Through this act, FDR legitimized labor unions in the United States. The Wagner Act guaranteed the right of every worker to join a union and not be fired. And it also guaranteed that employers must bargain with their employees in a union. Labor unions who had suffered for so long from such a bad image now feel redeemed. Roosevelt also approved an increase in federal funding during the Second New Deal to many agencies such as the PWA and the WPA. He wanted to reinforce federal offices that oversaw the construction of schools, hospitals, post offices around the nation to better the quality of Americans' lives. Roosevelt's strategy in 1935 to reconnect with the so-called forgotten man in American society was very, very successful. He easily won a second term in office in 1936 over the Republican candidate Alfred Landon, garnering an almost 61% majority of the popular vote, the highest ever in a presidential race until that point. We need to take a look, though, at some interesting changes in the behavior of voters, especially by the 1936 election, what many political scientists refer to as the so-called New Deal coalition. In this election, President Roosevelt is going to enjoy the support of many groups that had not previously voted for a Democratic nominee, most notably African American voters, who had remained with the party of Lincoln, the party of the great emancipator, which was the Republican Party, since the days of Reconstruction. Now, however, we are seeing black voters turn out en masse to support the Democratic nominee for the president. Why? Well, many black Americans directly benefited from a number of the New Deal's welfare and economic programs. We also see that Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, worked hard to end discrimination against African Americans in society. Women, too, were an important part of the Roosevelt coalition. The strong example, again, of Eleanor Roosevelt, who pushed for women's rights, demanded equal pay, traveled across the country, wrote newspaper columns, and spoke out on behalf of women. She became a potent symbol for the growing importance of women in public life. And of course, labor union activists and immigrants voted in droves for President Roosevelt, especially after the passage of the Wagner Act. Despite Roosevelt's victory and optimism that perhaps through his New Deal programs the Depression was coming to an end, the Depression dragged on as another recession hit in 1937. Consumers simply did not have the money yet to purchase what American industries had produced, and employers were still not hiring in large numbers. Fatigue was starting to settle in for many Americans. This depression now has been dragging on for almost a decade. So as you can see from the chart that I have here on the slide, you'll see actually an uptick in unemployment again in the United States in 1938. We have greater strike activity and unrest. You're going to see that for President Roosevelt, while he enjoys a second term in office, you're beginning to see some people saying, are we not over this yet? Why have we not pulled out of the Great Depression? All these ambitious plans laid out through the New Deal, are they not working? I say all this because starting as early as 1938 during midterm elections, you're going to start to see a Republican resurgence in Congress, which had been dominated by Democratic lawmakers during Roosevelt's first and early second terms. We're starting to see, in other words, that the president no longer has a clear mandate to just continue with the New Deal, and some people are beginning to mount a challenge to that. We also see that several of Roosevelt's original New Deal programs, the AAA as well as the NRA, have already been struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So in other words, the president is now facing much more vocal criticism. He's actually seeing parts of his New Deal being dismantled by the Supreme Court. I say all this because it's important to put into context what happens with FDR's court packing plan, why his plan will basically backfire badly. As FDR comes under increasing pressure to pull the nation out of the Great Depression, and he's seeing some of his beloved New Deal programs being reduced to ashes, in 1937 he's going to introduce the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, or what becomes known as the Court Packing Plan, in which he's going to make a not-so-subtle attempt to take control of the Supreme Court and influence the justices there so that they would no longer gut his New Deal program. Specifically, Roosevelt asked Congress to give him the power to appoint one new Supreme Court justice for every existing member of the court over the age of 70. That would have given the president 6 new appointees. The presidents before him, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, had all been Republican presidents and had appointed conservative-leaning judges. Roosevelt sought to counter the influence of those conservative judges who had already struck down the AAA and the NRA. This did not go over well, not only with his political opponents, but also your average American who believed that justice should be blind to party politics. So, needless to say, this bill does not come into law. FDR does not get the opportunity to sort of change the slant of the justices on the Supreme Court. And in short, we're seeing enthusiasm for the New Deal was dramatically dropping off by the late 1930s. For this reason, we're not going to see a whole lot of new change coming about initiated by the Roosevelt administration. They simply now don't have the majority in Congress to push through any new ambitious ideas. By 1939 and 1940, FDR was now speaking of maintaining his gains instead of forging ahead with new programs. In the end, the New Deal failed to achieve full economic recovery in the United States. However, it did end a tremendous amount of fear generated by the Depression, and it restored a sense of stability to society and the economy. Now people were increasingly looking to Washington, D.C. instead of their state capitals for an answer when the nation was in a financial slump. What we will see is it will be mobilization for World War II that will finally bring American businesses out of the financial slump that they had been in now for almost a decade. But certainly the New Deal directly offered relief and helped to alleviate the plight of many Americans during this tough time.